Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for some of you. Thank you very much for being with us today. My name is Franco Passacantando. I am the scientific advisor of Istituto Affari Internazionali, and I've been asked by the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance to coordinate a research project on the topic of local infrastructures and to organize a series of events on this topic in the year of the Italian presidency of the G20. This is the second and most important event we have organized so far, and others will follow. The two speakers who will introduce our webinar today are the President of Istituto Affari Internazionali, Ambassador Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, and the Director General for International Financial Relations of the Ministry of Economy and Finance, Mrs. Gelsomina Vigliotti. I hand it over to you, Ferdinando.
Thank you, Franco, and welcome to all participants wherever they are. I understand from your presentation that some of you are in Asia. And I would like to, first of all, to thank Gelsomina Vigliotti not only for being with us today, but for her personal involvement in this project. As Franco said in his introductory intervention, this event is part of a project that the Istituto Affari Internazionali is developing in collaboration with Bruegel, but with the support of the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and also with the personal participation of some of its officials. This project is meant to provide a contribution of analysis, but also of policy recommendations to one of the items of the agenda of the G20, which this year will be chaired by Italy, by Italian government. And everybody is aware that among the various challenges that the G20 is facing this year, certainly probably one of the most important is to define a strategy to relaunch international cooperation and multilateralism in a period where the world is still confronted with the pandemic and with the consequence, the economic and social consequence of the pandemic. I think it's common sense to imagine that a central focus of the agenda of the G20 under the Italian presidency will be on the idea to define a concerted strategy to stimulate sustainable and inclusive growth and employment. Now, in this context, infrastructure, and in particular investment in infrastructures, have been for years one of the central issues of the agendas of the G20, but this year, this very subject is probably even to be more important than in the past because of the social consequences of COVID-19. Now, at this stage, it's not clear when, how, and to what extent world economy will recover, at what speed. But we are aware that national governments and international institutions are working on the definition of strategies to restart long-term growth. A key factor, inevitably, of these strategies will be the capacity to mobilize, stimulate, and even reorient investment in infrastructure. It is, of course, the case for nationwide or transnational infrastructures, both physical and material, which will be inevitably a major component of this agenda. But investment in local infrastructures are particularly important because social needs, work habits, production patterns have been greatly, deeply affected by the pandemic. And so local infrastructure and investment in local infrastructure will be crucial, both to address the short-term needs to sustain recovery, but also to address long-lasting or long-standing problems, such as, for instance, climate change or social exclusion. So today's seminar will be the occasion to present and discuss a paper which has been prepared by the Istituto Affari Internazionali and which will focus in particular on the question of local infrastructures. In March, within this project, there will be another event where Bruegel will present his contribution to the project with a paper focused on green investment. Today, the focus will be on public policies issues such as, for instance, measures to improve the enabling environment needed by subnational local entities, local communities to reduce risks and promote a more resilient growth, but also on fiscal and regulatory instruments needed to subnational entities to promote investments in infrastructures. And last but not least, on financial instruments capable of mobilizing resources needed to create infrastructures. So I would conclude my very short remarks by thanking once more Gelsomina Vigliotti and his team, Franco Passacantando, who has been the scientific and is the scientific coordinator of this project, Nicola Bilotta and Alberto Pozzollo, the author of the paper which will be discussed today, and all the participants who have accepted our invitations. Thanks, buon lavoro, as you say in Italian, and Gelsomina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm particularly pleased to stay here today together with the Ambassador Nelli Feroci, with Franco Passacantando, and all other people who worked for this event. As you know, actually, as Ambassador Nelli Feroci said, we decided already several months ago to work together with the Istituto Affari Internazionali to develop this infrastructure agenda. You know, the infrastructure agenda, it's very high on among the priorities of the finance track of the G20. And actually we wanted someone supporting us in developing ideas to push forward this topic, which is particularly relevant, as already said, at this particular juncture where we have to foster the growth, the recovery, and we all know that infrastructure could be a main driver of growth, of job absorption. It can support sustainability and also foster inclusion. So let me go ahead with my notes, and I would like to start by saying that recognizing that the G20 countries, many of them have reacted to the pandemic with exceptional stimulus packages to address the emergency, including infrastructure plans to stimulate the recovery. In our view, the current juncture should be seen as a window of opportunity to reflect on new paradigms, foster transformation growth, and deliver the broad-based prosperity in the post-COVID world. With this in mind, we have structured our G20 infrastructure work plan around 4 main pillars. First, resilient infrastructure. Second, digital infrastructure. Third, sustainable infrastructure. And fourth, inclusive infrastructure. Today's event is organized under the umbrella of the social inclusion pillar. I think that we all agree that we should encourage more inclusive infrastructure investment. The pandemic has shown how necessary is the inclusive dimension of our infrastructure systems today, given the significant implication of the crisis on regional and local communities. Indeed, the infrastructure should be designed to smooth differences across territories and improve the inclusion of the most vulnerable groups. To secure an inclusive recovery in which no one is left behind, looking at the experience of local entities whose policies are traditionally the closest to the citizens' needs and preferences, could provide an alternative bottom-up perspective and can create positive spillover effects also at aggregate level. More attention should also be paid to rural areas. In a world where cities are continuously evolving, we cannot allow rural areas to be marginalized and left behind. We should avoid the depopulation of some areas and, on the other hand, the excessive congestion of urban centers. To this purpose, we also need to rethink the urban spaces, restoring and reusing areas and giving them back to people with improved services. Let me underline that this approach is fully aligned with the vision proposed by the Italian G20 presidency, which revolves around 3 pillars, the so-called 3 Ps: people, planet, and prosperity. Today, our intention is to promote a discussion on financing local transformative infrastructure, given that the local governments are responsible of most of infrastructure investments in many G20 countries. Local authorities provide a wide range of essential services concerning education, social, and healthcare. Ensuring and encouraging adequate financing to these entities is crucial. Governments should encourage a better use of limited resources available in order to improve the quality of social infrastructure projects. To this end, the national authorities should improve their policies to direct private sector funds at subnational level, invest better, and increase the quality of infrastructure systems, and this is key. First of all, government should understand which financing strategy is the most appropriate to invest in each sector of infrastructures delivered at a local level. There are several obstacles that do not allow an efficient and effective public and private investment in local infrastructure, as poor procurement practices, low employees planning skills, sometimes corruption, and low coordination among national, regional, and local levels. The aim of today's workshop is also to focus on the problems that are typical of local infrastructure financing and stimulate a discussion on how to support and strengthen the quality of the local infrastructure delivery. Let me conclude by saying that the main deliverable of our agenda in social infrastructure will be a high-level conference on local infrastructure to be held in September, and I really hope that it can happen in presence, which will include the inputs from this workshop as well as the other workshop which has been scheduled for March and which will be also organized together with the International Affari Institution and the think tank Viola in Brussels. Let me conclude by saying that we are honored to have you all here today online with us to this webinar, and we look forward to your valuable input to stimulate the G20 discussion, not only today, but through the course of this year. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Thank you, Gelsomina. I would like now to say, first of all, a few words on how we have structured this conference. But before doing that, let me inform you that we have just released the background paper that has been written in preparation for this conference by Professor Alberto Pozzolo and Nicola Vigliotti from IAI. The link to the paper will appear in the chat, at least that's what I'm told, and I hope it works. It is work in progress, and we will be happy to receive any comment or suggestion based on your experience or knowledge that you would like to share with us. So how did we structure this conference, this webinar? Well, the first point that we would like to address is to better understand the economic and social consequences of the crisis which has hit the global economy. We all know and we see with our eyes how this crisis has radically changed the way people work, the way we live, the way we travel, for those of us who still travel. Now, the most visible impact of the crisis is on the places where we live and on cities. Cities have also seen an unprecedented increase in poverty. And according to the World Bank, the pandemic will create between 143 and 163 million new poor worldwide. And the new poor are projected to be more likely to live in urban areas. So the issue of social inclusion that is part of the priority of this G20 is crucial to this, to the focus that we are giving to cities. But also cities are at the center of the green transformations, because cities is where more than 70% of greenhouse gases are produced. And so what cities can do to improve their environmental standards can greatly contribute to the climate agenda worldwide. Now, of course, the crisis is still unfolding, and it is very difficult to make predictions on how much and to what extent the transformations we see today will be long-lasting. Most importantly, how much the digital transformation will change the way we work, the way we buy goods, the way we travel. Now, to better understand this, we have asked Professor Andres Rodriguez Pose to play the role as lead speaker in this conference. Andres is Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics and has a long track record of research on regional growth and inequality. He has pioneered the research on the lagging behind areas of the world, or on what he calls the places that do not matter, and where unfortunately people do not see the future for themselves. He also has been awarded important prizes for his contribution to the understanding of regional disparities and development. Recently, he has done specific research on how the COVID crisis will change the structure and morphology of cities, suburbs, and metropolitan regions, and to what extent these changes will produce long-lasting transformation. So, Andres, I hand it over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Franco. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and in such large numbers. I would like to thank the Istituto Affari Internazionali and the Italian government for this invitation. It's very nice to be at this G20 meeting, and I hope that the hosting of the meeting will be a great success. Franco Passacantando asked me to focus much more in my presentation on the work that I have been doing on regions and cities in a post-COVID world. That is work that most of it is joint work with Michael Storper from UCLA and Richard Florida from the University of Toronto, and to try to link it to my previous work on infrastructure and the impact of infrastructure for the development of cities and regions. And well, needless to say, we all know that we are all living in very turbulent times, and that we have a massive pandemic that has shaken the world, and it's having significant geographic implications. Let me start by saying that, of course, COVID-19 is not the first global pandemic, but is the first to do so in a much more connected, digital and globalized world. We have to go back a century to see a similar pandemic, but the pandemic of 1918 to 1920, this so-called Spanish flu, was something that happened in a very different world. And it's a pandemic that has expanded so rapidly and so fast because of, so widely across the world because of the greater connectivity with cities, and especially large cities, which are the main hubs, the places where international travelers come and go, but where that have become these hubs of the pandemic with the big density and agglomeration that has helped expand this illness, COVID-19, worldwide. And by many, as a result of this, and as a result of the relatively lengthy lockdowns that we are all enduring wherever we are, it is being considered by many as a turning point in the territorial distribution of economic activity, in the territorial distribution in the medium and long term, perhaps, of wealth. Many have heralded the pandemic as perhaps the death of the large city as we know it. Are large cities going to continue post-2021, post-2022, once we start recovering, having the same role as catalysts of economic growth as they had before? Is the pandemic, with all its negative toll, with all its the problems it's generating, but does it represent an opportunity for a more balanced growth in which areas that have been left behind, areas that in many cases did matter or mattered less than they did before, can play a new role in a more balanced, let's say, territorial and equitable territorial development? And this is something, are we going towards a new flat world? So is the prediction that Thomas Friedman did in 2005 going to be materialized in this post-pandemic world? And in order to do that, we have to understand what have been the drivers of the pandemic. There's a massive amount of research that has been ongoing about what are the factors behind the pandemic. There are a few areas in which most people agree. It's affecting the most connected places more than anywhere else. It's being diffused through strong density in places where you have a lot of people, a lot of crowdedness. Then it leads to a greater impact of the pandemic, affecting in many cases the poorest and more unequal society. The poorest of the poor within our societies, and especially in unequal societies, is associated to different types of climatic conditions, but also to greater levels of pollution. And the response of our institutions, the response of our governments is playing an important role. Greater polarization, lack of coordination is behind, in many cases, what have been responses that have left until now a lot to be desired, depending on country and even within countries. But even if there is some agreement on the drivers, what we have is that we're still struggling to understand how it goes. This is a map of regions in Europe, and this is the incidence in terms of excess mortality over the previous 5 years of the pandemic, during the first wave of the pandemic, and between January and the end of June 2020, in terms of excess mortality across regions. And what we find is that there's a very, very uneven geography. There are places where there has been either no excess mortality, the whole of Norway, most of Finland, for example, many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, at least in the first wave. And there are other places where there has been significant concentration. The worst hit part of Europe has been the region of Madrid, but also Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. Lombardy in Italy is another case, but also other big cities like Paris, London, Stockholm, but also outside big cities, the northwest of England, the area around Maastricht, the area of Alsace in France. So it's a very, very type of different geography in which different actors and cities might play a role, but it's not always the same role. For example, let's take the 6 regions in Europe with the biggest incidence. In fact, many of them are cities or host big cities. It's the city of Madrid with the biggest incidence, with high concentration in the late month of March and early April. Lombardy with Milan, another large agglomeration. London, Catalonia with Barcelona, and the city of Stockholm, albeit at lower levels. Castilla-La Mancha is a more, let's say, rural, but also mid-sized city region, relatively close to Madrid, that had a lot of incidents. But not all the big cities have been harboring big numbers, at least during the first wave. We take a look at other regions in Europe. What we find is that places like Copenhagen, places like Warsaw, places like Lisbon, Berlin, Lazio with Rome, and Campania with Naples, that all host large cities, had a very, very low incidence in comparison to what we saw elsewhere. Other factors are also important to look at, and what happens within cities. I think that Franco in his introduction made a clear indication that what happens within cities is also important to know. And this is a map of New York and the incidents during the first 6 months of the year of the pandemic. Here, there's a link on the one hand to places that are close to airport hubs. JFK, you can see a bigger incidence in terms of cases, in terms of deaths. LaGuardia Airport, also a big higher incidence, but also in poorer areas of the city, the less favored, those that have been left behind, those that have been at the bottom of the income scale in places like the Bronx, for example, or in the eastern parts of Brooklyn are suffering far more, have been suffering far more from the incidence of the pandemic. But this is also not universal, because this relationship, which is very clear in the case of New York between income and incidence, so richer areas in Manhattan have suffered much less than poorer areas in the Bronx, is not something that we see universally. If we go to, for example, Madrid and London, the incidence geographically is very different. It affects some rich areas in the case of Madrid, also some in the case of London. So it's very uneven, and we don't see the same connection as we see in New York between income at the local level per borough or per district in the case of Madrid and the incidence of the pandemic. So the pandemic is going to bring transformations, and we're still grappling with them. So the question is, what are the forces that are providing this change, both at the macro level, so across territories, but also at the micro geographic level, which is within territories. And what we have here is that I'm going to have to make predictions. This is an ongoing pandemic. So the data are changing every day. The evidence is changing. Hopefully vaccination would make inroads all over the world and improve the situation quickly. But we cannot wait until to make analysis and see what we have to prepare for what's going to happen afterwards and the recovery right now. So this implies making predictions. And unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think anyone has a crystal ball. But we can say that the territorial impact would depend on a series of factors that we have to consider. First is the duration of the pandemic. When we were told in most part of the Western world, what happened before in Wuhan in January 2020, but then in March, when most of the Western world went into a closure, no one thought that this was going to last as long as it had lasted. We're all hoping that it's going to end up soon, but it might last relatively long. There will be other factors that are very important. The social and the political conditions in each territory, in each country, in each region and city is going to make a difference. How prepared are we? How solid are our institutions to fight the pandemic? So the institutional conditions also matter. And there's another factor that we cannot avoid, which is the question of luck. Why the pandemic struck some parts of the world more than others. It might be down to a lot of other factors, but luck plays a role. So making any prediction is going to be risky, but as I said before, we need to make predictions and we need to take some risks, informed risk on the basis of the evidence we have. We have three types of forces of change that seem to be affecting the way the geography in the post-pandemic world is going to evolve. The first one is that the pandemic is leading to social scarring. What is it meant by social scarring? Is the fear by individuals and by quite a few individuals to be in public places that is being developed in the pandemic. So lengthy confinements are creating social problems, but they are also creating psychological problems. We are much less at the moment, we're more much less inclined at the moment than we were not that long ago to actually interact with other people. We interact at a distance, etc. So that is going to perhaps permeate into behavior in the post-pandemic world. The second one is that we have had to implement, especially in our physical space, changes in order to maintain social distance. There have been transformations in the way we teach, in the way we shop, in the way we sit in restaurants, in the way we sit in terraces, in the way we travel both across the world by airplane, but also within our cities when taking public transport, for example. And the third one is the results of the force social experiment that has plunged large parts of the world into lockdown. And this is, I'm going to take the words of Franco that was mentioning, this has implied significant changes in first the way we work, the way we have seminars like the one we're having right now, that is a global seminar, but we're not all in Rome, or we are all sitting in our rooms, in our offices, home offices, doing a seminar, in the way we shop and in the way we interact. And many of those changes are going to last. So when you put all this together and you put it across different territories, what are the implications? Well, first, these are changes I have highlighted. They're going to be changes in the way we shop, changes in the way we work in large numbers, and changes in the way we interact. And you're all familiar with all of this. And the implications might be important for the way we configure our physical space and the way we behave in physical space. Just some figures, for example, before the pandemic, in a country like Norway, for which I've been doing quite a lot of analysis, which is not a country where Amazon has got is active on the place there. What we find is that in 2019, the year before the pandemic, there was no growth in retail commerce, in retail trade, but online commerce grew by 40%. So before the pandemic, we were all switching massively already to internet shopping in all ways. With the pandemic, this has accelerated massively. And what we're starting to see, and there's a picture from what's happening in the UK, is that spaces in retail, this is what my colleague Richard Florida calls the retail apocalypse, are being vacated because they're no longer viable. And they are concentrated in certain parts of our cities. So what we're going to see is a loss of physical space, especially of small retail shops in city centers more than anything, also cities big and small. Many large retail complexes also suffering as a result, and a bigger transformation. So the pandemic has turbocharged the whole transformation towards online shopping. Distance working, remote working is probably here to stay. It's not that we're not going to go back to the offices. Once this is over, many of us are going to return, and many of us are actually longing to return. But it's probably the case because there are advantages, or certain advantages, that workers have appreciated. There are certain advantages to firms. There's also the evidence that sometimes, if not always, productivity has not declined massively with remote working, that there would be mixed systems in which people will go to the office for certain days, but work from home or from elsewhere, wherever they are, other days of the week. That would also liberate a lot of offices, office space, which mainly would affect city centers. And of course, there would be differences in the way we interact. Restaurants are not going to remain empty for very long, but probably there's going to be more reluctance to travel long distances to go to restaurants. In the future, there's going to be more local restaurants, and there's going to be also more entertaining at home once this is over. So when you put all this together, this might have impacts on territories. And here's where we enter into predictions. What about the macro geography? What is going to happen in the relationship of territories, in the hierarchy of territories? And here what we can say is that there are going to be changes. Let me just start by saying that I don't believe that we're going to have a much more even geography after the pandemic. The pandemic seems to be feeding, albeit with differences depending on countries, on the poorest of the poor, both in terms of income distribution, but also poor territories seem to be less prepared, less capable to fend off not just the health challenges, but also the economic and social challenges that the pandemics are generating. So this idea that we're going to have a more even distribution, a happier sort of territories, is probably not going to materialize. We cannot hope that the pandemic, just by magic, is going to solve the problems of economic development. And I'm going to go back into that in a moment. probably many cities are still going to go steam ahead as they have done for the last 3 decades. It's not going to happen everywhere, but many cities have got, large cities have got significant advantages. They create positive externalities, they concentrate talent, they attract investment, they generate more innovation, knowledge that then can be diffused, and many of them are going to remain the hubs and the motors of economic activity. And in many cases, what we're going to see is perhaps even an even greater polarization than what we have seen until now between large cities and medium-sized cities, small cities and towns. It doesn't mean that medium-sized and small town cities are not going to thrive. There are quite a few that are going to thrive. But on the whole, probably on the balance, is going to be still tilted towards the large cities. Rural areas and towns are probably going to lose more. There are some that are going to benefit, those that are more accessible to large cities or even to prosperous medium-sized cities, those that have got better amenities and offer a better quality of life, but not all are going to be able to compete and many are going to lose out. So probably at the macro level, we're going to see relative limited changes with respect to the trends that we have seen recently. What about at the microgeography level? What is going to happen? Probably the biggest changes are going to happen within cities. Less office space or less demand for office space, less need for retail space within cities, less leisure space, more need for open space. It means that probably the biggest hit is going to be taken within the city and especially within the city center. That is going to change. There might be a change in uses, probably more cultural uses. There might be a change in habitation, perhaps at the beginning with some decline in house prices and real estate prices. But this might be a transformation and taken as an opportunity by other groups to move into areas that have become more accessible, more empty, and probably a bit more affordable. Suburbs might win at the beginning. And what we're going to see is a shift in some cases in the sort of activities and the sort of functions that are happening there. So this is where we need to be thinking, because a lot of the transformations and a lot of the policies that we're going to have to implement is saying, how do we rethink the city and the interaction within the city? And there's a lot going on. We're talking about the 15-minute cities. We're talking about open cities, creative cities. We're talking about leisure cities and cultural cities. There has been a lot of discussion about new residential uses and also about how to make transport much more sustainable, but also safer, and with balances or with different approaches of some that are actually promoting bigger use of the car, where others are shifting to other forms of transport big time, like, for example, the bicycle or the scooter or other alternatives. So what's the role for infrastructure investment in all this? After all, this is you are going to be discussing infrastructure, so I'd like to say a few words about this part. First is, when we talk about COVID and the pandemic, we cannot hope and we cannot expect that COVID is going to solve pre-existing development problems by magic, as if like magic. So we will need to act. COVID is probably in many cases going to accelerate some of the problems that were simmering, that were already there, but we thought the transformations were going to take some time and they were not going to explode. So COVID is going to increase the necessity or the need to act right now. Because otherwise the risk is of greater polarization and rising discontent, as what we have seen in many parts of the world. So the emergence of the Gilets jaunes, mainly coming from areas that have been losing out and have been losing out for some time, is not going to go away, but is going to be reproduced in many areas. So we have seen those sort of reactions in places like as far away as Chile, for example. And we will need development strategies to tackle them. We'll need development strategies that have been implemented for many years in many places, that we will probably need them more than ever. But they will have to be much more integrated within different types of territories. I mean, there would be transformations within big cities. There would be very different from what will happen in declining places, long-term declining places. There will be very different from what will happen in medium-sized cities and from what will be taking place in rural areas. So we will need integrated strategies at the territorial levels, with infrastructure investment being one of the main pillars, together with more emphasis on institutions, but also on improving the human capital, labor skills, the capacity of local firms and the local economic fabric to compete, to innovate, and also the attraction of inward investment, the attraction of talent, and all those other factors. But one thing that is becoming more and more evident, and was already evident before the pandemic, and it's reflected in some of the research I have been doing in the past, is that perhaps the emphasis that we have had in terms of infrastructure on big infrastructural projects that was dominant in the past, very often fancy projects, glitzy projects, is probably going to be counterproductive given the sort of transformations. It was already not working. I put a lot of examples from my home country, but I am Spanish after all. My home country has got probably the best network of transport infrastructure in the world. So massive endowment of motorways, second network in the world after China in high-speed rail, large number of international airports, etc. But despite 25 years, 30 years, the country has not taken off because it has forgotten about other parts. But it can be worse. So there can be a lot of high levels of investment, and with money actually not delivering, or resources not delivering the right infrastructure, like for example in the case of Greece, that took the best of 40 years to finish the main motorway between Thessaloniki and Athens, or even south of Italy, where some projects also took a long term. So that's the Salerno-Reggio Calabria motorway, for example. And we are also seeing that the returns of infrastructure policies very often vary enormously depending the type of projects and the quality of institutions in those projects. In the case of regions in Europe, what we have found, and this is work I've been doing with Riccardo Crescenzi and Marco Di Cataldo, we found that in places where you have actually relatively weak institutional quality, where your government efficiency is low, where there are high levels of corruption, where there's low levels of respect for the rule of law, the preference has always been for big infrastructure projects. You go for the glitzy motorway. You go for the big project that is visible and that might yield returns, either in terms of bribes or perhaps in terms of electoral returns when you go to the polls. But the impact of that type of investment in terms of generation of jobs, in terms of economic growth, has tended to be relatively small, if not negative. A country like Portugal has got, even above Spain, the highest endowment of motorways in the world, but it hasn't grown for the best of the last 2 decades. By contrast, what we are finding is that in the case of areas of Europe with a much better institutional quality, they have often chosen secondary roads to address bottlenecks in preference to highways. And that tendency to look into activity or interventions that actually have addressed existing bottlenecks has yielded much greater returns in terms of employment and in terms of economic growth, productivity, and even innovation. And then also, the emphasis in the past has been very often in transport infrastructure. When we are seeing that when we start doing the analysis, other types of infrastructure like digital infrastructure, but especially social infrastructure, seems to be playing a big role. Investments in, let's say, hospitals, which are necessary during the pandemic, but more investments in issues like, for example, better schools, more access to basic services, more access to public services, seem to be not just yielding greater economic returns, but also increasing the satisfaction of citizens and the well-being of citizens after infrastructure investment. So what can we conclude from this? Well,
we need to come to a conclusion. Yeah.
Yes, I'll finish in a minute. The first one is that although the pandemic is offering or is providing a big transformation, it's providing a big challenge to the territorial systems across the world, large cities are not going to die. They're going to be transformed. And many of the characteristics that made the cities thrive and whether past pandemics would remain in operation. We've seen that cities like Paris or cities like Chicago, New York were reinvented after relatively large, or London, cholera epidemics in the 19th century. The hierarchy of cities will more or less more likely remain in place, the hierarchy between cities and regions, and it would be naive to think that the pandemic alone is likely to address the huge problems of lagging behind cities and regions. Many of the pre-existing tendencies will be accelerated, loss of retail space, distant working that would remain in place. And this will liberate many inner city space in which there will be transformations, especially at the microgeographic level within regions rather than across regions, and especially within cities, with city centers perhaps losing initially, and I say initially because there will be a transformation, and suburbs may be winning at the beginning. So we might see a new flourishment of suburbs as we saw from the 1920s to the 1970s. And also the pandemic, with all its problems, with its horrific toll, it offers a window of opportunity to rethink how we promote development, how do we tackle inequality, and how do we address the problems that are linked to it. So there's a need to rethink our policies and rethink them well, with more attention to integrated policies and also more attention to the micro scale, especially within regions, but without forgetting that the importance of intervening across regions. And infrastructure will have a crucial role in this new world, but it would be a role that is different. It would have to be much more integrated, not as a standalone policy, but with other territorial policies, much more geared towards addressing local bottlenecks than providing large mega projects, and to make sure that within this integrated strategies, it is done in a way that ensures that we end up with a fairer and more just world, not one in which infrastructure may contribute, as it has sometimes in the past, to foster greater polarization between territories and as a result also between individuals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres, for this very, very interesting presentation. And I'm very pleased that you confirm how right is our approach to local and infrastructures. When we started this exercise, we were asked why the G20 should focus on local infrastructure. And you confirmed that this is actually the right approach if we really want to address the issues of poverty and also to better prepare the world for a post-COVID phase. Now we have to move to the next step. As you said, there is obviously a need for infrastructure, local infrastructure. It is not just transport and urban systems, but social infrastructures like hospitals, schools, houses for the elderly. And we all know, unfortunately, that the challenges that subnational authorities face are even higher than those at national level because of their usually more limited fiscal capacity, the greater difficulty to attract private investors, sometimes the limited administrative capacity. So to better understand the bottlenecks that local governments and local municipalities face and how they are reacting to the current challenges, we have asked Debora Revoltella to present the results of a very interesting municipality survey that she has conducted at the European Investment Bank over the summer of 2020, which includes 685 municipalities across EU member states. Debora is the director of the economics department of the European Investment Bank and has held this position since April 2011. Of course, her analysis refers to European countries, but the methodology she used and some of the conclusions I think would be very, very useful also for similar analysis on a global scale. So Debora, I hand it over to you. We have, you have about 10 minutes, 11, but I hope you can stay in this. Thank you, Debora.
Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to have an opportunity for presenting the results of our studies. I think I have a presentation that somebody should share on your side. Okay, I see it coming. Perfect. I still cannot. Okay, sorry. Well, that's the complexity of the technicality. So we tried, but I'm always a little bit uneasy at the start. So what I wanted to do in my 10 minutes is to make an example of how we are reasoning at the European level, looking at local investment, and particularly investment of municipalities in the COVID era and at time of the green and digital transitions. The key message that I wanted to pass is that COVID is in fact enhancing pre-existing challenges that were already quite relevant at local level. And the challenges were coming from the green and digital transition with the enormous also social implication and investment and infrastructure needs that the municipalities were facing. And as said, it's only enhanced these needs. And so it's extremely important at the policy level to take into consideration how to deal with this in this moment and how to make the policy effort the most effective possible. And that's what I will do in the next 10 minutes. So the first one is to talk about public investment. And the question that I have is this time different? Is this crisis different from what we know? Then I will look at the local infrastructure gaps, what we see from our surveys, both resulting from the legacy of past years underinvestment and the challenge of green and digital, but also the new needs emerging post-COVID. And then the third point is what does it take to make a difference this time? So how can we make sure that this time the policy reaction really go where it's needed? I start with my first point. So can this time be different? Here I'm talking about public investment in general. I think there is a strong debate among policymakers and economists in this moment on the sustainability of debt when debt increases because of fiscal policy and fiscal policy related to investment activities. I think there is very much a consensus that we are in a condition in which with ultra low interest rates, we can afford some more supportive policies if those are directed to public investment that is growth enhancing. There is, and this is a quite important change in the mentality in the moment in which what we have seen looking at the European experience in the last 40 years, every time that we saw fiscal expansion also related to investment, after a while a fiscal consolidation episode was coming, and every time that a fiscal consolidation is coming, public investment gets deprioritized in the public expenditure, and actually even after 10 years of a fiscal consolidation event, public investment remains below trend. So there is quite some regularity in all countries at the EU level to show that when fiscal consolidation comes, public investment end up being the victim of this. So it's very important that this time we consider it different, and we continue to keep this very strong focus on public investment, something that at the current moment is confirmed in all the budget of all the European member states, but is something that needs to be confirmed in the medium to longer terms. But then if this time is different, so if this time we will keep this focus on public investment going forward, how can we take the most out of it? And here the important message is also on implementation capacity. So committing to public expenditure, public investment, expenditure is not all. It's important to have a proper planning, coordination to maximize the spillover, also address the barrier and the bottlenecks that prevent implementation of the public expenditure in public investment. And also, when planning, making sure that the complementarity of public and private investment is taken into consideration in order to maximize the impact. So that's my starting point, and the starting point is this time should be different. So after what we have seen, the crisis that we have seen, we should really keep this focus on public investment and make it as effective as possible. I move to the second point. So this is really coming from our survey, looking at local infrastructure gaps. So as Franco was saying, we interviewed more than 700 municipalities at the European level over the summer, asking where did they see investment gaps. There are quite some interesting results. This is just showing this slide is just showing the effect of crisis. This was the last global financial crisis, a decade of very low infrastructure investment, and also the component of local investment was affected. But then when we look at the municipality level, we ask to European municipalities if they feel they have some infrastructure gaps. We have more than 50% of European municipalities that tell us that in fact they have investment gaps. And this is also very different across different parts of Europe, with much stronger needs perceived in Southern and Central Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. But then when we look at where these investment gaps are, they are mostly related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, digital infrastructure, and urban transport. Post-COVID, municipalities tend to deprioritize what is related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, but continue to have a focus on digital, transport, and other social infrastructure at the local level. So it's also important to think that if we are committed to the green transition, also extra support for keeping the focus on climate change is important. The second graph shows something interesting. We ask a municipality if they have developed the capacity on the one side to manage the green transition. So if they have the structure to plan toward the green budget at the municipal level, etc. A number of questions to check if they have the capacity to deal with this. And then the second part is we ask them if they are digital, if they provide digital services. What you see is in the graph is who is not green and not digital. You have more than almost 70% of European municipalities that are non-green. They cannot deal with the technicalities of the green transition, and 44% that are non-digital, non-providing digital services. Even in Europe, that's a lot of a gap in terms of administrative capacity at the municipality level. We ask municipalities what are their barriers to investment. The first is showing the general barrier to investment, and here there is a lot. If we look at what they consider major obstacle, the major obstacle remains a lack of funding. But if we look at everything that is an obstacle, we also have a lot of issues related to regulation length, regulation uncertainty, coordination, technical capacity, a number of factors that tell you that funding is clearly a problem, but there is a lot also in terms of administrative capacity and regulation that is preventing investment at the local level to take place. Focusing only on green investment, funding seems to be the main issue for municipalities, but also I have to say that our perception is that at the municipality level, still there is not that much a focus on the green transition in this moment. Another point, I was mentioning the importance of internalizing this complementarity between public and private and public investment and local investment, particularly related to the green and digital transition. What we find out is that it's only a correlation, but when in municipalities that are more advanced in green and digital, you tend to have more firms that are ready to start the green and digital journey. So there seems to be some correlation between municipalities and firms in terms of moving together in terms of embracing into this transition. And the other point that I wanted to mention is that if the green and digital transition is an enormous challenge, it also offers opportunity. We have seen that the green transition may create 1.1 million jobs by 2030 in terms of clean energy employment, and this needs to be exploited. So advancing in the transition means also taking this opportunity, and at the same time also moving fast on digital, also at the municipality level, may be important because of the correlation private and public performance in digitalization, and also because at that point, digital firms are actually, they do better and they are more optimistic also on the job creation effect on new digital technologies. So moving fast in this digital and green transition at the local level may have a positive effect and may help to unlock opportunity, while still being a challenge, but the challenge is there and needs to be addressed. So I get to my last point. What does it take to make a difference? So this time seems to be different. This time there is much more commitment to public investment, and there is a full new narrative on the importance of keeping a public investment in the post-crisis. We have local infrastructure gaps. We see the needs that are related to existing, pre-existing gaps in terms of infrastructure, adding to the digital and green transition with the need that the digital and green transition have, and then the COVID pandemic adding on top. So we have the gaps. What does it take to make a difference this time? And I think my focus is very much on the implementation. I think the focus should really be in maximizing the absorbing capacity and making sure that the investment is really addressed to the major needs. Local investment is an essential part of this current investment strategy, and I think there is a growing literature showing that the local multipliers can actually exceed the aggregate one if the autonomies foster improved project identification and implementation. But then it also requires very much addressing the barriers, and as I was saying, the barriers are on funding on the one side, but also very much in terms of the planning and the coordination and the governance on the local public investment process that is there. Yes, I'm closing. So the maximizing. I think what I was saying is really the governance, the planning, prioritization, using a life cycle approach, incorporating sustainability when planning the infrastructure, and then also coordination among different actors is quite important along various dimensions. And on this, I wanted to just put an accent that even at the European level, the preparation of a municipality in terms of ex-ante assessment and coordination is somehow still lagging. To conclude, I think the message is that local infrastructure is an essential element of coherent investment strategies, and it's equally important to address both the funding needs, but also the ramping up the absorptive capacities. And there is a rule for institutions like us that are combining the lending part with the advisory and the sector project expertise, because it's really the combination of the three that will make the public investment more impactful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debora. Thank you, Debora. Sorry if I had to ask you to conclude. We are sort of running a bit behind schedule, but I think this was very, very useful, very helpful. I particularly appreciated the fact that we have opportunities. It's not just a gloomy picture, which unfortunately it is because of the social dramatic consequence, but there are also opportunities, and what you show that the ones who have more advanced in green and digital transformation are the ones that have perhaps a better future. So, but now it's time to go directly to those who have a direct experience in local government, to move also away from Europe and to go to a global perspective. So we will listen to mayors of different cities and responsibles of regional entities and consultants of local governments. And finally, on the second roundtable, we'll hear the activities of some multilateral development banks that are active on this area. So we will have two sessions. The first will be moderated by Viola Caon, Senior Editor of Investment Monitor, and the second by Jacopo De Toni, Editor of FDI Intelligence Financial Times. So Viola, the floor is yours for your session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Passacantando, and welcome to our speakers and audience. And thank you very much for inviting Investment Monitor to chair this panel. So this panel will focus on infrastructure development and financing in cities, and will draw from experience on the ground of such efforts, hopefully shedding light on a particularly relevant topic in the pandemic and post-pandemic scenario. A quick note of housekeeping. So I will shortly introduce our speakers. We will have up to about 8 minutes for their talks. And I will then open the discussion up to the floor. So please use the Q&A button to ask questions at any point. I will then pick them up and put them to the panel after they have presented their points. So first up, Mr. Charles Landry, inventor of the creative city concept and advisor to cities. Charles works with cities around the world to help them make the most of their potential. He is widely acclaimed as a speaker, author, innovator, and he facilitates complex urban change projects. Thank you very much for joining us today. Charles, over to you now.
Well, great to be here. I'm going to give a bit of a tone for this session. I mean, basically, 2020 was a year of radical reckoning, and it obviously made us have to think afresh. And crises like the pandemic provoke a dramatic ordering of priorities, as well as obviously deep reflection and rethinking. And importantly, our hubris, I believe, has been humbled. And there's a sort of dawning of humility, I believe, or should be at least. And it's created both clarity and confusion, because in the eye of the storm, it's difficult to see where next and how to get there, because there's no particular blueprint to move forward. Now, of course, some think the old normal is an exotic destination, but the older urgencies exist, and you all know what they were. But what it's focused on is what really matters, namely the common good, the public good and the public interest. And of course, old certainties have crumbled, but it has reminded us what we have lost. We know what that is, but also has given us a glimpse of a gateway towards possible futures. Now, obviously, the crisis was a health one, it's an economic one, it's a social one, but most crucially, it's a psychological one. Anyone who was there and is there as we are now knows the way that's seared into our brain, and that will have quite strong effects on how we work things through in the future. And of course, it hasn't unfolded in its fullness yet, but we'll all see. Now, we all know, every international organization knows that we're in the midst of a systemic crisis where a business as usual approach will not get us to where we want to be. And we also know that our economic order is materially expansive, socially divisive, and environmentally hostile. So that's the negative side, that's the fear and all of that. But there's also an opportunity for massive creativity. And I believe we should try, at least try, to have a glass half full approach. And in so many places, when you scour the earth and the cities, you have seen so many examples where the impossible became possible. In my mind just comes in Berlin, not regarded as the most agile bureaucracy, that within 36 hours was able to send out checks to 5,500 people to help them overcome their problems. And therefore, I do think there are opportunities in the challenge. I mean, just think of self-cleaning door handles, safe elevators, safe public transport, new kinds of theatres and cinemas where you can still be together, which will create an urban collective experience. The idea that we can create the 15-minute city, reinventing social interaction at a distance. I'm just thinking here of Seoul, Paris, Bengaluru, many others. We can discuss that in the panel. Now, of course, there'll be financial innovations too. I mean, here in the UK, bounce back loan schemes to support local business, etc., to deal with this tsunami of debt. And I believe startups will have massive chances. I'm thinking here at the moment of the COVID hackathon in Germany, where 45,000 people took part and it led to 800 projects. And some of these innovations will be permanent. Others will be transitory. And one requirement is absolutely clear to me when you're looking at cities and as a whole, is you need to think holistically. All this segmentation between economic, social, and all of that is absolute nonsense. It's this integrated way of thinking that will probably work, not silo thinking. Now, of course, in this, there's the digital turn, and we shouldn't use the word paradigm shift too often, but that is clearly one. And it's accelerated what has already been happening. We're all Zooming, we've got Zoom fatigue and all of that. But most importantly, and this relates to place and space, is it changes our sense of time, place, and space. And the volume, variety, and velocity of all this instantly available data and this anytime, anywhere, any place phenomenon changes how we experience and perceive our realities and where we are. So of course, the culture is digital, the digital is culture, it shapes our culture. And it's like the air we breathe and the electricity that flows. Now it shifts this sense of self. And obviously it's all about being open, flexible, agile, sharing, enabling, immersive, but it's also and this is where place becomes so important, it's fragmenting and it's fracturing, and it's sort of giving us obviously fatigue. But what it has done, it's given people the opportunity and it's liberated them from a space-bound identity, and it flattens our geography, and it changes cities, and it changes our sense of belonging as well, when our belonging is dispersed both through place and through networks. Now, that nomadic lifestyle that we're leading, perhaps not physically so much anymore, is obviously gives incredible opportunities for smaller cities in particular, because that means they can do things. If you don't only have to be in an office one day a week, you can live 100 kilometers away. Anyway, there are major opportunities evolving there. But the key thing is the power of place. Place matters than ever before, more than ever before. Place identity and place attachment are key, because they create anchorage, belonging, lots of other things, and so on. And this, you know, obviously connection and opportunity. Now, the desire for community will always be the same, but the forms in which it's taking are different, so that it's stable but different at the same time. And it changes the way cities work, how they're designed, or it will, and how they will be navigated. And third places clearly will rise in importance. There's places that are neither at home or at work. And the public realm, therefore, and therefore investment in it and public space will rise dramatically in importance. And obviously these third places you know of, you know, cafes, informal places, museums, and so on. And urban planning itself will change, which is why we need to think so in an integrated way, because it will focus more on the notion of placemaking, which is an integrated, holistic approach to making places work, rather than this segmented approach before, which was purely the physical, rather than understanding the non-physical as well. And of course, in all of this, the local will rise dramatically in importance. And I think, of course, cities will remain. And I think perhaps the big cities will be revitalized by the young. The testosterone imperative will mean they want to gather, and so on. So it will also create something important, which is a reordering between state, I believe, and city. That was already prefigured by the new urban agenda, Habitat, because governments have the authority to run the rule systems in some sense, but it is cities who are closer to citizens who can implement the necessary dramatic changes that are happening.
Charles,
now,
we will come to
I'll come to a conclusion. So all of that will basically shift investment priorities and patterns with a greater focus on healthcare, the digital, etc., social innovations and transport. A final word, all of this is also about the bureaucracy. My obsession, you can get the book from the Istituto, which is basically, that has three pillars. We need to, in one sentence, you could say, it's how do you move from a no because to a yes if culture? And the three pillars are, how do you change the rules and incentive systems for now? How do you enable the inner life of the bureaucracy to work better? And how does it connect better with civic and business worlds? Just a tiny final point. The last event we had 15,000 unique visitors, but the most important thing for us was that 48% of those were under 34 years old. So there is a desire to change the way things work. Thank you very much.
Very much, Charles, for your insightful talk. I'm sure our audience will have many questions for you. I can actually see a few coming through already. Now, let me introduce our second speaker for this session, Madame Yvonne Aki-Sawyerr, OBE Mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone. She was sworn in as Mayor of Freetown in May 2018, with a commitment to transform the city using an inclusive, data-driven approach to address challenges in the city. The 3-year Transform Freetown plan was launched in January 2019. Madame Yvonne, over to you. Looking forward to hearing about your experience.
Thank you very much. And it's been fascinating listening to the other speakers, the earlier speakers, because of course the focus has been very much on a European experience of a city, which could not be more different than or further away than the experience of Freetown. So in this session, I think I've been asked to focus on Transform Freetown as an agenda, but also looking specifically at urban mobility and urban development. And let me start off by saying that the driving force with the challenges that my city experiences actually begins with an explosion in the population. It begins with rural urban migration, which came into a city where there was no urban planning. And I just want to put that into perspective. The value of urban planning in terms of being able to more efficiently deliver services in a city, more efficiently deliver urban mobility. And I think just having that realization at the beginning that where you have growth on a large scale into an environment which isn't planned creates chaos. So what we're dealing with in Freetown is that chaos. It's 35% of the city residents living in informal settlements, what people would typically call slums. And the consequence, because it is a consequent, fallout, strain on the little infrastructure there is, whether it's infrastructure in terms of sanitation, water, energy. So the ability to provide basic services is really hampered by having a city that isn't planned. So as we look at Transform Freetown, what we sought to do was to, collectively with our residents, build a plan for addressing in an integrated way the challenges our city faced. We can't directly speak to the issues of rural urban migration because that's a national government level issue. And that's one of the interesting things about where cities find themselves. We're recipients of problems very often. And in many instances, we haven't got the mandates to directly address the root causes of those problems. What we're really able to deal with are the symptoms. So how are we dealing with the symptoms? Transform Freetown has 4 clusters: resilience, human development, healthy cities, and urban mobility. And within those 4 clusters are 11 priority sectors. And what we did in 2018 was to articulate, working with city residents, but also working with academics, the private sector, people in the development space, articulate 19 specific targets that we wanted to achieve against those 11 sectors. Unsurprisingly, urban mobility is one of those sectors. It's a cluster and a sector, and urban planning and housing comes in within our resilience cluster. So what have we seen and how are we financing it, which is a big question today. We're just concluding our second year report. And what we have seen is that for where we started, again, I'm making the distinction between cities in the West and a city in the global South. A very small percentage of our financing actually came from city revenues. And that was because of a lack of systems. Within Transform Freetown, one of our achievements of the last 12 months has been to digitize property rates. We've actually done a geomap of the entire city, working from a satellite, taking the dimensions, the measurements of every roof, sending enumerators into the field, and building up a comprehensive database, which has moved us from 30,000 properties on that database to 110,000. That is the beginning of sustainable investment, of being able to secure financing from within the city. But when you're starting at from a low base, you actually need a bit of additional support. And we have in the 2020 year, this year just gone by, looking at the revenue of the council for specific interventions, 60% of that has come from, 66% in fact, has come from development finance, just over 30% from the private sector, investing with us in private-public partnerships, and then a small percentage, about 2% has come from own source revenue. That's got to change. In this period, as we contend with COVID and we contend with climate change, I will conclude by saying what's been really important for us from the perspective of Transform Freetown has been recognizing that whether we're dealing with the pandemic or we're dealing with our development trajectory that we were on already, Transform Freetown, access to funding is a major constraint. And one of the reasons it's a major constraint, of course, there are many, but one reason which is sometimes overlooked is the relationship between city, national players, and international finance, particularly in the development space, where inevitably the larger percentage, World Bank, the UN, ADB, etc., will work through national governments and not directly with cities. So I think part of the discourse that we have as we talk about urban planning, urban mobility, and on urban mobility, can I just quickly say, there's been so much talk about people, having to get back into public transport. Well, the public transport we had was not the sort of public transport you want people to get back into. It was low occupancy, very, very inefficient, really high emission emitting. And so we are working on a plan to introduce a cable car system, which will actually leapfrog, so what we're hoping we will see is our population not going down the route of cars. 80% of people do not have cars of their own, but moving from inefficient, quote unquote, public transport, it is public transport, to efficient green mass transit. For all of this to happen, there are bottlenecks in financing that need to be unlocked. And part of the conversation that needs to be happening at the G20 and in other fora is, where do cities sit when it comes to the financing infrastructure? How can cities have more direct access to funding and not have to go through national bottlenecks, which are sometimes, well, almost always unhelpful. So thank you very much. And I wish us all a good debate.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Very, very interesting thoughts to unwrap in there. Now I'd like to introduce Madhavanai Rajeev, former president of Eraviperoor in India, who has worked on using digital technology to improve local infrastructure. He has been awarded a national level for his e-government, rural development and agri-tech initiatives. So Mr. Rajeev, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours now. I believe you're still on mute. You need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, ladies. And thank you all for giving me a chance for such a wonderful platform. And before going through the details of the local level experience, I may just brief on the local body system, how it works in our state, apart from the other states in the country and apart from the other countries global wide. Our local bodies are like local governments. In our state, 3 types of governments are there, like central, state, and local. So we are acting like local self-governments in a base of 3S system: funds, function, and functionaries. So except law and order, all other department officers were coming under local bodies. Since this has been the system functioning in our state, there starts challenges. The Gram Sabha, the gathering, Gram Sabha means the gathering of the people of a ward. Ward in the sense, ward of a well-defined area having 1,000 members of population. The Gram Sabha is fixing the needs and necessities of the particular ward and of the whole Panchayat as well. So priorities of the Gram Sabha suggesting is fixing by the working group for each sectors. Thus, the annual plan of the local body is based on the people's plan method. So the local government system, how it works in our state, is on the basis of decentralization of powers and the people's plan with the people's plan method. Local body in our state have 3 types of funds. First is own fund. This is generating by the local body themselves. Local body themselves with a building tax, then license fee, professional tax, fine and penalties, etc. are the sources of own fund generation. Second is budget allotment. Almost 30% of the state budget is reserved for the three-tier system in the state. Three-tier system in the sense, three-tier local body system. Local level Gram Panchayat, then block Panchayat, then the district Panchayat, like that. So 30% of the budget is reserving, state budget is reserving for the three-tier system. The budget allotment of each local body is ratio to the population and the assets of the local body. Then the annual plan is formulating on three ways, like productive, service, and the infrastructure, and also special component plans for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. Again, some subsector like women and children, old age, disabled, etc. subsector plans are also should be included with this fund, like on fund and budget allotment. During my tenure, the opportunities of the local bodies has utilized at its maximum, and I tried my level best to ensure the social, economical, and environmental justice to the people of my local area. I'm not going through the sector-wise project details and all due to the time constraint, but some are like rejuvenation of the river, then our own brand value-added products, online service delivery is a unique one we adopted in our Panchayat, then sport council for the students, national quality assurance standards, NQS achieved the health centers, old age care for the wellness of the physical and mental wellness of the old age people, plastic road as part of waste management. These are some of the projects we implemented in our local body area. We are mainly focusing on digitalization. So on COVID base, we start with 42 services we are giving from the local body office, like building permit, then preferential on ownership certificate, building, numbering, ownership change, so on. So for getting this service, people have to come to the office and filing their application. And we adopted a time-stipulated service delivery system in our local body office. Within that, the people have to come to the office and get file their application and getting their service. But what we adopted newly is an online platform we developed and a P2P concept. P2P in the sense, nowadays the P2P itself is working like a people to Panchayat. Now we started within COVID time, we started Panchayat to people. The reverse one we started with, and the people need not come to Panchayat office, the local body office, and get their service or filing their application and all. And we are having some more digital initiatives like that. I may, due to time constraint, I hope it can be explained while the question comes and all. So this is in brief I may share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajeev, for your talk and sharing your experience on the ground when it comes to digitization, which is a very topical argument at the moment in the community for sure. And now, last but not least, we have with us here today architect Nemeh Katanani, engineering director at the Greater Amman Municipality. She has more than 20 years experience working in the public sector in the field of engineering, architectural design, urban design, site coordination and management of strategic engineering projects. Since 1999, she has worked in the Greater Amman Municipality and occupied many senior positions. So Ms. Katanani, over to you.
Good evening, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Honorable mayors and distinguished panelists and participants, it gives me a great pleasure to be among you today on behalf of His Excellency, the Mayor of Amman, Dr. Yusuf Al-Shawarba, Also an opportunity to extend our sincere gratitude and to the Italian Ministry of Finance and Economy and International Affairs for organizing this session. We were asked to share Greater Amman Municipality, specifically Amman experience and in the challenges that the city is facing in the planning, financing, and implementing its local projects, especially in the infrastructure field. Let me start by giving you a quick introduction to our city, Amman. Amman is the capital of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. It occupies around 800 square kilometers, and it is inhabited by 4.2 million residents, which accounts for 40% of Jordan's inhabitants and population, 55% of the total employment, and 80% of the industry activity is in the city of Amman. Amman is also an emerging one as one of the most important cities in the Middle Eastern region. Like any metropolitan city in the world, Amman is facing a lot of challenges, specifically in the development of its urban sprawl. What are the main challenges that we're facing? First of all, the rapid urbanization, scarce of natural resources, specifically in water and energy. We are the third poorest countries in water, and we don't have any natural fuel sources. Also, there is the major and the most important challenge that we are facing is the city population continuous flux due to the political, geopolitical circumstances and the successive influxes in refugees, as you all know. Urban sprawl also is one of the major challenges, loss of cultural, agricultural lands, the unemployment, about 40% unemployment, single use of zoning and development, the high annual growth rates in energy consumption, and the climate change impact, socioeconomic segregation, and one of the major also challenges is the lack of sufficient urban public transport systems. Like one of the participants has said, or the panelists, the digital transformation and the digital infrastructure readiness for the municipality. Greater Amman Municipality is an independent, administratively and financially institute. Therefore, our budgetary is only financed by our own revenues. We don't have any budgetary from the cabinet or the treasury of the government. We only depend on providing our self-generated revenues from the taxes, fees, and building license, building permits, vocational permits, and etc. While the main expenditures are operational, development, and expropriation. Around 45% of our budget is allocated for the infrastructure and the local investment infrastructure projects. Although GAM has relatively high institutional and professional capacity, a sound approach to performance management, and has developed key financial management tools, including a 5-year plan and long-term financial forecast. Despite these strengths, GAM faces a number of challenges, specifically in the financial aspect, the significant debt levels, due to the explosion in the population, as we have mentioned before. Adhering to the sustainable development and green growth principles is crucial for rapidly growing cities like our city to align with economic growth and pass and environmental social challenges, and to minimize the need for trade-offs. Through Greater Amman Municipality Strategic Plan in 2017-20, we reflect the city vision in adopting 7 main pillars: institutional performance, financial management, infrastructure and public works, environment and health, urban planning, investment, and local community and city identity. The strategy focuses on rationalizing consumption, maximizing revenues, and improving collection policies, while increasing capital investment and planning for GAM's financial sustainability. So how we finance our infrastructures and how we finance our projects. There are 2 ways of financing. The first is the internal financing from our own budget. But for the reasons that we have mentioned and the challenges, and I forgot to say that the impact of the pandemic also has increased these challenges, especially on the financing and funding aspect. And in order not to compromise the level of service that we are providing for our citizens, we have to look for other external financing tools or resources, such as the loans and the grants. Therefore, through the cooperation and agreements with international funding agencies and financing agencies, donors community, we could cover a lot of the service and the basic needs for the city, such as the urban transit and urban public transportation systems, urban planning and green growth projects, environmental and waste management projects, green infrastructure, also the city resiliency to the climate change and flood flushes that we suffered for the last 5 years due to the climate change, supporting the needs of the refugees and the hosting community. We have cooperated with many financing agencies. I could give some examples like the AFD for financing the first public transport system in Amman, which is the Amman Bus Rapid Transit System. This is the first mass transport system in the city. Also with the EBRD, we have cooperated specifically and mainly in the environmental projects such as the landfills, the transformation plants, waste to energy projects. We also cooperated with the EIB, UN Habitat, International Rescue Committee, UNDP, and many other agencies to support the financing tools for the projects. In addition to that, GAM also is in several international development networks, has access that helps it to have access to several funds such as the Green Climate Fund, which helps channel climate financing projects and also serves as a crucial role achieving the Paris Agreement objectives. On another hand, to overcome the obstacles that are due to the traditional convenience bureaucracy, procurement processes and procedures, Greater Amman Municipality launched an investment arm. We call it Amman Vision Investment and Development, the AVID. It's a fully owned company by Greater Amman Municipality. Focuses on investing and developing Greater Amman Municipality assets and properties and lands through a partnership with private-public sector partnership BBB projects. In this way, we could also cover some of the basic services. For example, we have many projects in the field, slaughterhouses, and also the public transport projects, energy efficiency projects. Through these policies, internally and externally, we have been able to overcome the gap of the financing for our local infrastructure projects. Thanks God, we are now achieving a lot of the progress in these projects with this new policy of financing. And despite all the turbulence, history, and the ongoing challenges, yet Amman is growing to be a regional hub, paving the way for other Middle Eastern cities. Thank you very much, and I wish for this seminar the best and to be fruitful for all the participants. Thank you.
Very much, Ms. Al-Qatanai, and to all the other speakers for sharing their thoughts and experiences on such an interesting topic. Now I'd like to open the discussion up to the floor. We've had a few interesting questions coming from the audience, and I'd like to start with one to Madame Yvonne Aki-Sawyerr. So there's one of our members of the audience saying that the EIB 2020 Municipality Survey suggests that coordination among stakeholders is important, although the relevance differs by nature of municipality and project. So for which specific type of infrastructure project, in your experience, is stakeholder coordination particularly important? And how does one best secure and sustain buy-in?
Well, I would say all. Stakeholder coordination is important for all. There's nothing which you would leave out. And the way we've done it is to literally have everyone at the table. So back in 2018, when I ran for office, I had a campaign strategy. I had a campaign message, shall I say. And that's what sort of was the backbone for Transform Freetown. Within my first 2 months of being in office, we engaged 15,000 of our residents. So we had focus groups across the city. Then at the level of the technical, in terms of other stakeholders, we did presentations. We invited all the development partners, including embassies, to a presentation. We did the same for all the NGOs, international and local. We also went to the State House and we requested an opportunity, and thankfully we were given that, to present to all the ministers. So effectively the entire city understood what Transform Freetown was seeking to achieve in terms of the clusters and the sectors: environment, urban planning, revenue mobilization, etc., the 11. And then the next step was to invite all of these participants to be part of technical working groups. So this process began in June of 2018. And then in January of 2019, we published Transform Freetown in a big live, event where there was a real sense of everybody being a part. So that's how we built the stakeholder engagement at the beginning. But moving forward, we are constantly engaging residents and stakeholders. And when it comes to urban planning, urban housing, any aspect of city growth and development, if you try and do it as an institution on your own, you will fail. Because nothing can be done just from the office. You need the buy-in of ministries, you need the buy-in of private sector, you need the buy-in of civil society, you need the buy-in of communities. You especially need the buy-in of communities.
Thank you very much, Madame Yvonne, for your answer. There was a very, very interesting point to pick up on. Unfortunately, I'm conscious of time, and so I'll pick up one question more from the audience, and then we'll need to give the word to our next panelists. So Charles, there is a question for you from the audience, which I thought might be good to pick up. Someone a bit arguing against your initial argument, and so they're asking, so far, where is the evidence that the startups have contributed to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic from expanding? So I guess the question could be rephrased as, where could startups actually make a difference in mitigating the effect of COVID-19?
Well, the Office of Public Sector Innovation at the OECD has a sort of monthly newsletter rounding up all the innovations around the world that they at least can see. Some of them, of course, are coming from either the municipality itself, but others, a whole chunk of them, are coming from smaller entities. Now, whether that's evidence or not, I don't know, but I'm just, from my perspective, I can see some of those things. There was another question to me, by the way, about what's the evidence of doing something at a local level that actually creates greater sustainability. And I'm just thinking here of Lahti in Finland, which was the first city to do carbon trading. There's an app which again was developed by a startup, which means that if you're walking around, you get a gift of some sort. There's a benefit if you're not, or if you're cycling, rather than driving a car. And so more of these innovations are actually occurring. Anyway, there's a short answer.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for a very interesting conversation. Unfortunately, we are a bit pressed for time and we need to move on. So I need to wrap this up pretty soon. And thank you again for joining us and giving your contribution. So I'll pass on to the next panel now, which is going to be chaired by Jacopo Dettoni, editor at FDI Intelligence. Thank you very much again for having us of Investment Monitor here today, and over to you, Jacopo.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Viola, and what an interesting panel. So after hearing now the perspective of authorities at the city level, it is now time to collect the perspective of another major stakeholder in the infrastructure value chain, development banks. As mentioned, my name is Jacopo Dettoni, and I am the editor of FDI Intelligence, a specialist publication focusing on investment and for investment, published by the Financial Times here in London. First of all, let me thank the Istituto Affari Internazionali for having me, in particular Franco, Passacantando, and Nicola Bilotta for coordinating all this incredible event. Needless to say that, as it's already been remarked in the previous sessions, that the COVID-19 pandemic has really triggered a big paradigm shift in the way we live our cities and therefore also in the way we should plan our cities moving forward and unlock investment in urban infrastructure. Development banks are a key actor in providing or mobilizing finance for infrastructure investment at the national as well as the local, subnational, local level. And today we are lucky enough to have with us a very diverse panel with the representatives of 4 different development banks operating at the global, regional, and subnational level across the 5 continents. So let me briefly introduce them one by one, and then we can just get started with the discussion. With us today, we have Nita Pokhrel, who is a unit head for project administration within the South Asia Urban and Water Division of the Asian Development Bank. We have Monica Scatasta, who is the Director for Technical Assessment and Monitoring at the Council of Europe Development Bank. Next, we have Sergio Guzmão Suchudolski, who is the President of the Development Bank of Minas Gerais, a state in Brazil, obviously. And last but certainly not least, we have Same Waba, the Global Director for Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Global Practice at the World Bank. We will have a first round of introductory remarks, where I would kindly encourage our panelists to limit their interventions to the time that we have allocated and agreed previously, and then we will have a more open discussion will unfold, and I encourage everyone in the audience to share your questions with our panelists using the question button and the question box in your chat window. So I'm aware that we might not have Mr. Waba at the moment yet. If this is the case, let me start with Ms. Pokhrel. Ms. Pokhrel, the Asian Development Bank, a few years ago, this was a pretty staggering study. The Asian Development Bank estimated the infrastructure investment gap across your region of operation, Asia, is about $1.7 trillion per year until 2030. So do you want to share with us how are you as ADB and with your own particular group of work at ADB, how are you engaging with stakeholders at the subnational level to contribute to closing this humongous investment gap? Thank you.
Thank you. First, thank you to IAI for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. This is a very topical issue in the Asian Development Bank at the moment. Everybody before me has highlighted that COVID-19 will shrink the already inadequate financing for investments. So we do finance our subnational clients directly. We have done so in India, the large municipalities, but where we have and will focus more is this enabling environment. Do they have the subnational, especially small municipalities, have the tools, the capacity or the frameworks to really mobilize the resource requirements? And I think before me, I was very interested to hear Madame Yvonne from Freetown. The similarities as pretty much the same in Asia, developing Asia, where decentralization may have happened on paper, but the subnational entities are yet to really have the authority, the teeth to bite. We look at, do they have the capacity, the tools to raise and reform their taxes? We work with them on these governance structures to do so. We work with them in terms of availing financing readily. For instance, the intermediaries, financial intermediaries, they may not be perfect. We work with some in the Philippines. We work with many in developing Asia, in South Asia. There's one in Nepal called Town Development Fund. And if you look at them directly, they may not qualify, but they will avail the financing readily to 110, 150 small municipalities cities. And we work with the government at the national level, because we do have that leveraging capacity. We bring a lot of financing into the country to maybe occasionally write the debts off. And we have seen that this sort of imperfect but financing intermediaries are needed, will need to be more and more strengthened to really make the enabling environment, give them the tools. Madame Yvonne talked about digitization. Most of our clients in South Asia do not even have double entry accounting. They are still relying on really ancient non-scientific taxation tools. So how do we unlock that potential? And when we look at private sector, for small municipalities, we don't expect international private companies to come. So who are these private sector entities? What are the risks they perceive? Can we buffer them? Can we blend our financing? Can we really look at the risks, and we as multilaterals come in to say, are these local level risks, or do they permeate all the way up to the central level where we need to unlock with more leveraging? There's also where we come in. So let me stop here. You have given limited time, but again, we have many case studies in India, in Nepal, in Philippines of working with these land development banks, local level banks. We also, again, heavily work on capacities, tools, and frameworks. So the enabling environment for PPPs may not be there. Again, it may be on paper, but the teeth to bite may not be there. So this is where also we come in handy. And lastly, I also liked what Madame Yvonne mentioned. The communities have to own the infrastructure being proposed. We also really look at, is there a citizen interface in planning, in delivery, in maintaining it? Because unless you have that, there's no willingness to pay, there's no cost recovery. Financing alone is not enough. The sustainability comes when there is that ownership from the community. And that's where also we come in heavily to support.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Ms. Pocrell, for this introductory remarks.
Just call me Nita.
Thank you, Nita, and also very interesting to hear about like the kind of challenges that you might be facing in your region when it comes to the subnational level. Challenges like dealing with maybe with communities that where double entry accounting is not set up or function yet. So this really gives you a feeling of the magnitude of these challenges in certain geographies and communities. And I'm definitely curious to hear more about your own personal experience in dealing your own case studies as you define them, to hear more about the way you deal with these sort of challenges. But let me now bring in Ms. Scatasta. As I mentioned, Ms. Scatasta represents the Council of Europe Development Bank, whose focus is on projects with a high social impact, also in territory and communities that for scale and size and geography are not necessarily a primary focus for bigger development banks. Ms. Catasta, I understand that you also believe that a governance upgrade is needed, across the whole value chain of infrastructure investment, either it be a subnational government level, but also at the other stakeholders that participate in the process. So do you want to elaborate a bit further on the kind of governance upgrade that you want to advocate for?
Yes, thank you, Jacopo, and good morning to all of the participants, and many thanks to the Istituto Affari Internazionali for inviting the Council of Europe Development Bank. Indeed, listening to the previous speakers, both in the first panel and in the introductory remarks, what really came to the fore is the set of challenges that are facing us in the capacity to address the chronic investment gap in infrastructure, particularly in social infrastructure, and also the specific challenges of local authorities. In this space, the CEB, the Council of Europe Development Bank, with its eminent social mandate clearly, as you were saying, Jacopo, focuses on investment that promotes social cohesion, integration, and the focus on vulnerable groups. But in starting with the idea of integration, the importance of thinking in an integrated manner, which has come across very, very often in the interventions so far, we are clearly focusing in a much more, let's say, intense manner, starting with our 2020 to 2022 strategic plan on integrating social inclusion with environmental sustainability and climate action as well. And this focus on looking across silos in terms of objectives, but also thinking in an integrated manner at territorial level has really been discussed also so far. So we look at integration in two ways, both horizontally, supporting therefore integrated planning at city level or regional level, at appropriate territorial level. We have worked with cities across, as I said, there are 42 member countries. I can give you the example, for instance, of one city that we've been working with in Albania, Vlore, where indeed we've been focusing on supporting the development and now the implementation of a citywide urban regeneration investment program in partnership with the government of Albania, in partnership also with the European Union and the Albanian American Development Foundation. And here the focus on looking at the different dimensions of investment and the different dimensions of the needs at urban level all come to the fore to try to achieve a transformational impact, focusing on improving attractiveness, for instance, of tourist side, focusing also on tourism of proximity, which, as was being discussed earlier, will become increasingly important in the future, enhancing accessibility and decongesting traffic by supporting new ways of different types of mobility and enhancing environmental sustainability of the city through investment in public recreational spaces. So thinking systemically is what we've been doing, not just with Vlore, but also with cities in Finland, in Italy, and across the spectrum. Now, this is one area. So taking the territorial approach, support the territorial level, thinking very locally and very close to the local space. And as the previous speaker was saying, also working and being able to finance also smaller centers very often through financial intermediaries, which enable us to reach a larger number of smaller entities, and in the case of Albania, for instance, the Albanian Development Fund. Now, what's important when we think of governance, and I want to link also to something that the mayor of Freetown said, but also Debora Revoltella earlier, is not just about the territorial development, the territorial approach across sector, but it's also the integration vertically, the importance of making sure that the voice of cities, that the requirements, the requests in terms of investment needs is actually taken into consideration, for instance, now in the drafting of recovery plans, and therefore that this dialogue between the national and the local comes across. And this we've seen in our dialogue with mayors is not necessarily always the case. We've seen, for instance, a focus on new investment when needs maybe were more on the need to finalize and complete existing investment. So there's really an issue of dialogue, as has been said so far. And I think that with our capacity to speak both with national government and with local government, we can have a role to play. In the vertical integration aspect, so the multi-level governance type of challenge, I think another, and I want to take a specific example from one sector, the water sector, where underinvestment is also a challenge, continues to be a challenge, and it's a sector where indeed investment can generate both social and environmental benefits. And here we have been discussing for many, many years, and still the solutions are not necessarily in sight at scale. The difficulty of addressing investment that looks at the appropriate territorial scale, at the river basin scale, and that addresses therefore these difficulties that come with multi-level governance. So to conclude, because I think what we need to, as financial institutions, to echo what Debora Revoltella was saying at the beginning, the importance for us to work through our financial instrument, through our lending, but also through our advisory role and strengthening the capacity of local governments, but also strengthening the dialogue between local and national is fundamental. And by doing that, by strengthening the capacity, by supporting the quality also, and the capacity to reach the intended impacts of investment projects, in and of itself, we can help private finance identify infrastructure as an attractive asset class, particularly at this time where the markets are facing high liquidity, very low returns, and where private investors are increasingly trying to seek investment that demonstrates value, thinking of discussion on stakeholder economy now going on, stakeholder capitalism, fresh from Davos, but also investment that appropriately manages climate-related and environmental risk. There are increasing demands for that, and the role of IFIs in assessing these aspects and therefore demonstrating how we can invest locally in infrastructure that do that can play a role in attracting private finance alongside clearly the structured finance, the de-risking aspect, elements that Nita was talking about earlier.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Ms. Scatassa. I think that that element of capacity building and also the element of facilitating the dialogue is certainly key, and we can touch upon that later. But let me now bring in Mr. Sergio Guzmão, our guest from Brazil, from the Minas Gerais Development Bank. That is the biggest state development bank in Brazil, to get also a feeling of a regional at state level. Obviously, Brazil is a federal state, at the state level development bank. Mr. Guzmão, so do you want to share with us what do you think can be the role of subnational development banks when it comes to generating an adequate level of interest in infrastructure investment with private investors, and how yourself and how your institution is engaging with local communities to make sure that there is a match between their demand and the offer that you offer investment that you can find in the market.
Thank you, Jacobo. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'd like to salute my fellow panelists, and also a big thanks to Istituto Affari Internazionali and Nicola Bilot for the invitation. Indeed, this is my third incarnation in development banking. I have worked for the National Development Bank of Brazil, BNDES, that it's widely known. I have been the Director General for Strategy and Partnerships at the New Development Bank in Shanghai. And I've been serving as president of BDMG, which is a 58-year-old institution in Brazil since April 2019. So I'm almost completing 2 years here at PDMG, and we were able to gather a very technical team in order to strengthen our capacity and serve our clients. Minas Gerais is the second largest state in Brazil in terms of GDP and population. It's a very historical part of Brazil. It's the heart of Brazil in a sense. And we are also the state in Brazil that has the larger number of municipalities. So there are in Brazil roughly 5,500 municipalities throughout the country, and 853 are located in Minas Gerais. So we are really specialized in financing SMEs, medium and larger companies, but we have 11% of our portfolio dedicated to municipalities. And I'm talking about some of them being very small ones. 80% actually of them are less than 30,000 in population. So very small towns without the necessary financial sophistication to finance their infrastructure. And according to Brazilian constitution, municipalities in Brazil have many responsibilities, including for public services, health, education, water and sanitation, street lighting, and waste management, all of which can be financed by development banks. So the way that we work is really to bridge the gap. On one side, we have a project preparation fund so that we can help structure projects for these municipalities at scale. Sometimes we even have kind of prototypes that we can scale up and reproduce in different municipalities. And we also work through public calls, which we launch every 2 years. We are just about to launch a new round next month, where we can identify and finance local infrastructure in municipalities in the whole state. Bear in mind that Minas Gerais is larger than Germany in size. So it's a very large part of Brazil. And the way we do it is also partnering with many of the MDBs and national development agencies. So we've been working with IDB, with the European Investment Bank. We've been working with private investors also that are able to join arrangements in terms of public concessions. So we're very much part of that. And we are able to provide all the technical support, holding their hands and making sure that we can channel the resources that are available internationally and nationally and really channel to the last mile. So what we are working and advocating is the role for this last mile banks. I think it's very much in line with what Monica has mentioned and some of her expertise. And indeed, last year, we were able to head and lead one of the panels of the Financing Commons Summit, where we discussed and identified many of other partners that have similar jobs and missions as we have. In Africa, there are 12 of these subnational development banks only in West Africa. In Vietnam, in California, we have the California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, which is a very important institution. In Colombia, in Mexico. So I believe that we are living through a phase of revival of the subnational development banks, which, by the way, I believe are much more efficient in really being able to implement the three main international agendas at the local level. And I refer to the development finance agenda, financing for development of Addis Ababa, the Paris Agreement on climate change, and indeed we have a climate credit line with EIB, and of course the Agenda 2030. We are in the decade of action. We need to build and finance infrastructure, but infrastructure that is sustainable. So sustainable infrastructure, which requires not only the ESG factors, but in some cases, even changing the way that the engineering and the architectural design is made. So we need to do that at scale, not only some pilot projects that are very beautiful in Singapore or in European cities, but we really need to do that at scale. And the only way that I see of doing that is to mobilize institutions that share the same DNA. And these are the development banks. I understand the role for commercial banks in doing that. Some of them do it well, but many of them receive resources from multilateral development banks and mobilize it in their treasury activities, and without the development impact that modern 21st century development banks should be targeting. So just to make it brief, and especially in this COVID-19 scenarios, I believe that we should mobilize development banks at all levels, subnational, regional, national, and multilateral development banks, in playing all the roles as money banks, providing loans and guarantees, as being knowledge banks by providing the policy and the technical advice, and also being honest brokers by coordinating multiple stakeholders, especially when you are getting private players receiving concessions and managing public services. So I believe that these development banks can play a crucial role in this early stage project preparation and addressing the community. We are very close to the community. I'm receiving today a large number of recently elected mayors. We are addressing the needs of indigenous peoples. We are addressing the needs of regional deficiencies, because even in our state, we have a lot of regions that require different kinds of projects just because of their very nature and geography and human development stage. So I believe we should channel this fire power and use this kind of cascade effects to mobilize the resources, not only financial, but the technical resources to implement those very ambitious agendas that we have ahead of us. So I will stop here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, well, very interesting. Thank you, Mr. Gusmao. Certainly, the point that you raised about, for example, ESG and adjusting, possibly adjusting your infrastructure strategy to the new and emerging ESG criteria that are gaining so much traction amongst institutional investors, which is really what is making and moving the financial global markets is definitely key. And I would like to hear more about that in the next part, in the second part of the panel. But we also have now our last, but certainly not least, panelist, Mr. Sama Waba from the World Bank. So again, Mr. Waba, cities, we have heard throughout these sessions that obviously cities across the globe have been dealing with the kind of health crisis that triggered by COVID-19, but also they had to deal with the shrinking budgets because of slower economic activity, and obviously investors that for one reason or another had to be more careful in terms of like allocating their resources. So from your own perspective, what kind of adjustment is required for authorities at the local level to unlock investment into infrastructure projects in this new normal?
Thank you, Jacopo, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and thanks for the invite, Franco Passacantando, for inviting me to join you here. So I have three main messages that I wanted to share with you. One is a little bit elaborating on that context that you've mentioned, Jacopo, about cities in the front line of the pandemic, the context in which we're dealing with, and the second on what is it that one can unlock in terms of innovative solutions to investments and innovative financing. And the third is a bit of a reminder that we need to go back to the basics. So cities in the front line. So, I mean, cities have really been thrust to the forefront of this pandemic. I mean, they, at the same time, I mean, obviously it is an urban crisis. I mean, 95% of the affected population, you know, lives in urban areas or had recently moved from urban areas back to villages. Cities find themselves having to control the spread of the epidemic, and this requires lots of measures, including lockdowns, including repurposing of facilities, emergency preparedness capacity, etc. They find themselves having to care for the affected. That's both those who are affected health-wise by complementing national health services, but also the poor and the vulnerable who have been deprived of their livelihoods. They find themselves having to maintain the delivery of essential services, oftentimes at higher costs and in tougher working conditions, but also needing to plan for the new normal and jumpstart the recovery process. Now, this is a tall order for any city, let alone when they have to do that in a context of declining revenues, because the combination of the pandemic, the disruptions that it brought, and the lockdowns that the governments have introduced have resulted in the contraction of economic activities. At the World Bank, we've been able to measure this contraction of economic activities by looking at night lights, and through the intensity of night lights, you can very easily see, you know, what cities used to look like pre-pandemic, really bright cities, and then, you know, really the dimming of the lights, and then as they gradually start opening up, you start seeing the opening. So you can actually measure the impact through a proxy with the night lights intensity. Now, the decline in economic activities has an immediate implication in terms of the reduction in municipal revenues, both on a combination of taxes and fees and so on and so forth. Now, there are many cities that we work with, and we've done studies of their municipal finances. And what we found is that cities are invariably facing reductions in their municipal budgets anywhere between 15 to 40% this year, and also a projection. So basically the remainder of 2020 and in their projections of 2021, 15 to 40% less revenues than they traditionally had. When you translate that into what does it mean in terms of the investment budget, there are cities whose investment budget was reduced by as much as 60%, if not more. We've worked with cities in Romania, in Morocco, in South Africa, in India. So I mean, a large range of cities that we work with very different diversified revenues, and they are all facing this crunch time. So that gets us to the second point. In conditions like this, and especially as you want to jumpstart the recovery and you need to invest, what is it that you can do? So on the one hand, you know, we're seeing mayors and local governments becoming much more creative. They're looking at investments that A, could be cheaper, but B, could have important co-benefits in terms of greening the recovery and in terms of, if you will, the impact on the livelihoods, but also the improvement of the livability. You know, I mean, many people will have looked at this crisis, and, you know, you had quite a few rather erroneous statements that cities, because of their density, have resulted in this type of crisis or pandemic, you know, which is very much looking at the negative side of urbanization, like the congestion, the pollution, the pandemics, as opposed to the positive side of it, which are the agglomeration, the productivity, the knowledge spillovers, etc. So, and the answer to that is very easy. It's not about density. It's about the way density has been managed. Because, I mean, you can look at cities like Singapore and Seoul, and they've managed to handle the pandemic, you know, very well. And these are cities that are dense. And you look at cities that are much less dense, where, you know, the pandemic has spread with much more ease. So it's not really about, you know, the population density or the city size per se. It's about how that density is managed, and specifically whether it's livable density or it's the overcrowding type. And again, at the World Bank, we've done some studies. We took satellite imagery. We took the three-dimensional modeling of the city, building heights. We've calculated the floor space. We've spread the density over that floor space to figure out which neighborhoods in a city would have the ability to have, in theory, social distancing versus which neighborhoods would not be able to sustain that. We've also looked at the infrastructure. When you have communal water taps, when you have public toilets, these are vectors, you know, specifically obviously in slums and informal settlements, these are vectors for increased transmission of the disease. So we could do this artificial intelligence enabled diagnostic that have quickly enabled us to zoom in on the neighborhoods within a city which are more likely to be prone for increased transmission and becoming a COVID-19 hotspot, so that we can help the cities target the solutions, whether it's increasing in infrastructure, whether it's dedication of medical services, targeting their contact tracing, etc., to tackle these issues. Now, as cities are starting to look to do investments with less resources, but investments that have quite a few co-benefits in terms of the greening, in terms of the social impact, we found that, you know, these types of investments have also targeted livability to make cities more livable. So you get the interventions like retrofits of facilities, public buildings, energy efficiency retrofits. It's the type that saves you money with life cycle costing. It creates jobs. It makes sense. It improves the livability of the built environment. Quite a bit of investments in improving public spaces, in introducing cycling lanes, in introducing wider sidewalks, etc., creating conditions from non-motorized transport, all the planning, thinking about the 15-minute city and trying to bring more proximity between people and, if you will, their day-to-day needs. And these are the types of interventions that are not per se capital intensive, but that could jumpstart a recovery process and could also have an impact in terms of the population. Also, cities have activated their safety nets to support, you know, poor and vulnerable population. So that's the investments. But at the same time, this has also implications on the financing. So in terms of thinking about the financing, so we know that own source revenues have shrunk for cities. We know that intergovernmental fiscal transfers are disrupted. So at this moment, this is when you start looking at what is it that you can enable private sector participation. So thinking about public-private partnerships, creating conditions to bring private investment, putting these on a trajectory of creditworthiness. And this is particularly if you take the 500 largest cities with which the World Bank works, there are only 90 cities that are deemed as creditworthy either on international or domestic capital markets. So that's 18%. Of those 90 cities, only 32 have ever issued a municipal bond. So that's 6%. So 6% of the cities that we work with have a form of creditworthiness and could enable, you know, could tap into the capital markets. So thinking about what is it that you can do to strengthen the creditworthiness of cities becomes obviously critically important. And that's not something you can do overnight. This is something that takes a long time. You need to build their revenues and diversify them. You need to rationalize their expenditures. You need to think about what assets do they have and how can they leverage these assets. You need to think about their contingent liabilities. So there's a whole lot of things that you need to think about, the regulatory environment for private sector participation, etc., to put these cities on track. Lastly, you think about land value capture. As you're contributing towards urbanization, you are, with your planning decisions and infrastructure decisions as a city, increasing land values. Thing that says that you cannot share part of the about to share it back into financing that infrastructure. One last concluding statement. It is important to think about innovative financing, but at the end of the day, what is critical is not to forget the basics. The basics are own source revenues. You need to diversify these revenues. If you don't have a functional property rate or property tax systems, you need to introduce these. And you need to also think about intergovernmental fiscal transfers and the transparency, the formulas, the performance incentives by which national government allocates funding to local governments. And that's because it's very simple. If you really want to go and issue a green bond, you will not ever be able to do that if you have not have the basics to issue a regular bond. So the basics are critical if you also want to build upon them to head towards much more innovative solutions. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Jacopo. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr. Waba. Very fascinating. I was very fascinated by your discussion, the few points of reference that you gave us, particularly also the way you use satellitary images to understand what was really happening in cities across the world during these past few months, but obviously also these figures on the capacity of urban authorities to go out to the market with possible bonds they are pretty staggering, and definitely they are food for thought for anyone interested in this topic. So I would have many questions, but we are also receiving quite a number of questions from the audience. So let me just pick one right away. I think that Ms. Nita and Ms. Katassa, they are perfectly positioned to answer this question. How can smaller projects successfully get funded? There is a gentleman from the audience that highlights that sometimes smaller contractors or suppliers, they haven't got the scale to get funded, to get funding from the public sector, for banks, and even more so from, I guess, international institutions. Even worse probably now during the pandemic. So what would you say here? How can smaller projects get successfully funded? Let's start with Ms. Nita. You're still on mute, Ms. Nita. This is the mantra of our times.
Yes. Thank you. It is correct in terms of funding smaller projects or private sector projects. We have a private sector department, but they look at bankable projects. As Same said, the cities or the entities that are credit worthy will get priorities. But there are many tools, there are mechanisms, there are country programming that we do where the voices, the needs will come through this, what Monica also highlighted. We do bridge the subnational and national level dialogue. We do have processes of trying to engage with the smaller private sector entities. And now all the more with COVID-19 recovery phase, we are looking at how do we help private sector build green, with that topping up that is required, that banks like ours can help buffer, not only with the risks, but also the resilience, the adaptation measures that are required. So here again, the linkages, we have different entities in between, in MP, Madhya Pradesh in India, in Tamil Nadu in India, many state structures that we work with, who work with smaller municipalities. So again, these first, second, third degree dialogues through which the needs will filter through, and we do fund them.
Okay, that's fantastic, Ms. Skatassa. So what's your perspective also, again, enabling smaller projects also through a better dialogue between subnational and national level? And I think that also it would be interesting to understand whether, what's your perspective, obviously, when it comes to subnational and national authorities, a dialogue between the two parties. Are we talking about a political dialogue or a technical dialogue? Because I guess that this is also part of the question.
Thank you. Yes, let me address first the specific question on how can we ensure that financing is available also for smaller investment. I know you mentioned contractors, so I think there's also another layer to that question, but I'll park the contractor side for a moment. So I was talking about earlier about the importance of, in addition to going for specific infrastructure investment at greenfield level, but to look at the whole investment program of a city or of a region. And that's what we've been doing. I gave you an example earlier, but basically we've been working together with cities to look at their whole investment program, and in the dialogue with the city, One of the objectives is very often to also try to identify innovative solutions, smaller scale, nature-based solutions that may, as Same was saying earlier, also decrease the cost of achieving a certain objective and at the same time have multiple benefits. So through this dialogue and through looking at the program as a whole, you can federate larger and smaller investment in a whole package that then is easy, has a scale that is big enough for a financial institution to come in. Another way, I was talking about work through financial intermediaries that work then with municipal entities to be able to reach a multiplicity of small municipalities or even at village level, where with the size then of the investment and the presence of local contractors in the implementation of those investments will be clearly an element. So that's something that all MDBs have been doing. We've been doing it for a very, very long time. So there's nothing new. I like the point by Same of going back to basics. And I'm going to latch on to that because earlier I was talking about the ways in which the private sector indeed can be brought in. But I think that the complementarity, the point made by Debora at the beginning on not forgetting that certain investment will remain also eminently public, apart from what Same was saying earlier about the importance of making sure that your revenues are there if you want to go to the private sector side. But the issue that certain investment, particular investment that is focused also on more vulnerable groups in particular in terms of social integration, might remain and will remain eminently public, and public financing, the financing of FDBs for public entities will remain central. One more thing that I wanted to say going to this, because I forgot earlier about the small investment. Think about the potential that we have now also through microfinance, for instance, to reach to support investment in refurbishment, renovation of the built space, the living space. As Same was saying earlier, it's not just a question of concentration. It's not just a question of how big the space that you have at your disposal, but of the quality of that space, the health of dwellings, and that is something where through our microfinance lending we've been able to support investment in refurbishment, support investment in energy efficiency, which has this triple whammy of environmental, social, and employment creation. So there are an enormous number of solutions, and we have those in our hands, and we are supporting them. You asked me a tricky question. I'm not going to try to skirt it. I'm going to answer. I think that you need both the political and the technical dialogue. The technical, generally, when you have technicians local at national level talking, multi-level governance has worked a lot better at technical level. I was giving the example earlier of river basins. When you have technical people at the different level of governance, they tend to understand each other. The political dialogue, I think, is something that has increased and is increasing, and we can support, but indeed that is a fundamental element and very often a difficult one, as we all know, when working with cities that may be on different sides politically of central government. So I'm going to stop there because it's getting tricky and I'm not going to go there.
Okay, maybe we can come back afterwards on this now. I'm joking, but if you got anything to add, we can dig a bit further. Mr. Guzmao, let me ask you also on this. Your institution is probably like pretty close to your. Is a step closer to local communities. So how do you try to bridge this communication gap between the local level and the national or even regional and international level when it comes to matching funding needs?
Well, indeed, Jacopo, that's the beauty of our job, right? One day we are in very small villages of the Brazilian semi-arid, which is kind of very dry area of our northern part of our state. And the other day, we are attending COP25 in Madrid and talking to multilateral development banks and our colleagues from IDFC, the Club of National and Regional Development Banks. I also have the honor to be the president of the Brazilian Development Bank Association. So there are 34 development institutions in Brazil, spread out, all shapes and sizes. It's a very vibrant institution that it's now 51-year-old. And what we try to do is really to share the knowledge. I was listening to Mr. Waba, and I agree in part with what he says. I think that strengthening the credit worthiness for cities works very well for larger cities that will be able to issue bonds. Maybe 10 or 15 in the case of Brazil, maybe Hanoi can do it in Vietnam, you know, Shanghai and all the larger cities in China. But I think once you go to the second tier cities, they will not be able to do it. And I think there is a role that multilateral development banks sometimes play. There are beautiful examples from Asian Development Bank, from IDB, from other banks, but not that regularly, which is through the credit enhancement mechanisms. Just to give you an example, we have ourselves just issued a first SDG bond. Yes, SDG bond with the framework in place, with the second party opinion, and we registered it in New York through a private placement with IDB Invest, the private arm of the Inter-American Development Bank. It was a costly operation, but we wanted to start our international career in the bond market. It was very important. We had discussed with London and Luxembourg of doing an issuance in one of those stock exchange, but we couldn't do it because of our rating, because our shareholder rating pulls us down. The financials of the bank are very good. We never had any kind of mismanagement, but unfortunately the shareholders rating pulls us down, although we are a few notches above it. And I think that in these situations, using the AAA rating of the multilateral development banks is very efficient in really bridging the gap so that our bonds can be attractive and that we can issue them recurrently, not only one pilot, you know, kind of a beautiful issuances. So I think this is an example of how you can mobilize private capital, even or some of the institutional investors, and catalyze private capital for local investments. The other way is how I explained before, which is really using our expertise, using blended finance, using concessional finance for riskier areas or more greenfield, sort of out of the beaten track. I think this is where we should really play the additionality role that it's very much discussed internationally. But we only have a few examples, a few transactions as of today. And I think that we need to multiply that. We really need to do that at scale and really focus on the operational side, not only on the beautiful new technology things, which I believe it's very important, but really on the scaling up the operational side, really mobilizing those resources where is most needed.
Okay, Mr. Guzman, thanks a lot. Also interesting points about like raising finance through multilateral development banks and their credit rating prowess, if you may. Mr. Waba, we have also one for you that goes back to something that Sergio touched upon in his first intervention. So the coordination and the collaboration between multilateral development banks. So you as World Bank, in your team, what are you doing to try to enhance cooperation between multilateral development banks on infrastructure projects?
Thank you, Jacopo. So for us, I mean, this is really central to our engagement. So to give you a notion of scale, if you look at I mean, there's various estimates out there about what's the gap in terms of urban infrastructure need globally. But whatever it is, I mean, you get the State of the City Climate Finance Report of 2015. It says it's like $4.5 to $5.4 trillion per annum. I mean, that's the whole world. You prorate that, you get something for the developing world. I mean, whether it's $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, you compare that to the entirety of official development assistance, it's a drop in the bucket. So, and that's official development assistance, all sectors combined. It's not just for cities. So clearly, whatever funding exists within multilateral development bank is not going to be the panacea or the solution. That's why I'm overemphasizing the point on, you know, it is about own source revenues. It is about fixing the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. It is about public-private partnerships and drawing in the private sector and putting in place the regulatory environment that draws the private sector. It is about creditworthiness, because whatever money that we have is just priming the pump as opposed to doing a solution. This said, because such money is negligible, its power is in the leverage effect and its power is in the collaborative arrangement. So we at the World Bank have a major emphasis on working collaboratively with other MDBs, with bilateral development banks. So to give you a few examples, today in our collaboration with the Agence Française de Développement, we have about $2 billion in co-finance programs that we've co-financed together, you know, where, you know, the Agence Française de Développement in some places might not have that, they want to, you know, grow in certain places, might not have the presence. We have the presence. Sometimes, you know, we work jointly, sometimes we bring complementarities, and sometimes the needs of our client are much more than each institution can bring. So being able to go together enables us to do much more for that client. By client, I mean the city or the partners that we're working with. And at the same time, enables us to have a coordinated voice for policy reform. Because if I go with my 50 million and we're starting to talk about serious long-term reforms that involve, you know, the transport sector and the solid waste management sector and cross-sectoral coordination and spatial planning and working across municipalities in inter-municipal arrangements, we will not be able to do that. But when we go together, we achieve a lot. I'll give you an example. In Senegal, we're co-financing with the European Investment Bank, with AFD, and with the Spanish cooperation and the World Bank. The four of us are co-financing the National Solid Waste Management Program of Senegal. And at the World Bank, we've used the credit enhancement that Mr. Guzman was talking about, of, you know, which is the mobilization of a private investment in the new landfill for the city of Dakar, which is backstopped by a guarantee that we've, both of us, the Spanish government and the World Bank, leveraged from the European Union. So that's one example of bringing together a group of MDBs and bilaterals, bringing in the private investment to be able to do something that is much more than the sum of the parts. One last point, going back to Mr. Guzman, so my turn to also agree with him in part. You know, the importance about the credit enhancement and the guarantees and whatever that multilateral development banks would be able to bring is not to transform a bad project into a good project. It is to be able to address some asymmetries in the risk. So for instance, you know, you're trying to attract investments, and that's the guarantee of the EU. You're trying to attract investments to invest in sub-Saharan Africa in resilient urban infrastructure. There's no track record of private investment in cities in Africa, in urban infrastructure. Some of it might be that global public good that Monica talks about. So to be able to package these transactions together, that does not mean that the city of Dakar per se does not have the ability to repay that loan, but it's that perception of investors that may block them from going in there. When you're talking with smaller municipalities, there are other arrangements. You know, you can get them into an inter-municipal consortium. You get, you know, either a regional or a national intermediary, you know, a municipal development bank, etc., an infrastructure development fund, and you can work with them to structure that. But it needs to have some sort of a sunset clause. I mean, what you're doing is you're creating the conditions to basically tackle that risks that exist, that perception that's misaligned, and then create the conditions for investment to see the opportunities in there. Back to you, Jacob.
Okay, that's great. I think that we have 5 more minutes, so I would encourage you to keep. We have time for one question each or one comment each. So please let's try to stick to this 1 minute mark. Ms. Scatasta, I know that you want to add your input on a new criteria for infrastructure investment.
No, actually, I just wanted to come in on my last minute to chime in on the point of cooperation across international financial institution, and not just international, national, regional, as Sergio was saying. And I wanted to link back to what happened in November at the Financing Commons Summit. I think that could be a turning point. It's true, all of us in DBs have been working collaboratively, co-financing in the preparation of project and also at national and local level in the dialogue on policy reform. We are facing a decade that will define maybe survival for our species on this planet and the planet's future. And I think that we need to get into a different gear. And I think that the joint declaration came up today following the Financing Common. And what we are doing now, what we're called to do is really to work in coalitions, but to truly do that, to think of how we can have a transformative impact, as Sameh was saying, very often by federating additional investment in certain area. We have to get into a different gear. And in addition, there's one area where I think we all have to work better together, which is in the coordination of the upstream dialogue and the preparation of investment of projects, etc. Because the problem that we have, and we all know it, is a proliferation very often of preparatory facilities with different requirements, and it's a maze for our clients. So we really have to get into a different gear now. We have an opportunity. We're going to be working together with AFD on a specific coalition focused on social infrastructure, and we invite others to join us. We will be joining others this afternoon, sitting in the water one, for instance. So this is a good moment, but we really have to, step up the game.
Okay, I would like to pose a very final question to Ms. Nita, Ms. Waba, Ms. Sergio Guzmao. I think that the debate around the urban infrastructure in the past few months has all kind of like developed around this concept of resilience. So cities should learn to be not only competitive, not only to be obviously functional, but also obviously more and more resilient. Let me be a bit provocative here. Is resilience a bankable concept, Ms. Nita?
It has to be. The GDPs are shrinking. We think in developing Asia, it will shrink post-COVID anything between 6.5% to 9%. And what COVID-19 has brought upfront is more the need for resilience. But again, going back to how do we be resilient? It's just not, we can't say to the cities that go and fund it. We are driving ahead to build for SDGs, to recover. But then the back to the basics, the capacities, the tools, the frameworks to do so, this is our opportunity to reshift, to really use this green recovery, reshift into ADB has also made its pledge in our strategy 2030. For every dollar we bring, we will bring co-financing of $3. For every dollar we will bring mobilized, leveraged private financing. So this is our opportunity to move into that gear of how do we have the budgets ready for resilience. It doesn't come naturally. Adaptation measures have to be paid for. Capacities have to be built. So we have to totally reshift that, and this is the opportune time.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Guzmao, is resilience bankable? And also as a follow-up question, maybe how do you measure it?
Well, that's very good. But first of all, I agree 100% with what Sameh last in his second remarks, and I enjoyed it very much. I agree with you that you cannot turn a bad project into a good one, and having good projects is the beginning of everything. And I very much enjoyed the arrangements that he referenced, and I think it ties to what it is. I mean, this is what we're living now, right? Which is the age of climate change, right? And the climate risks, risk metrics are already being used by commercial banks, by ourselves, by our risk areas. This has been going for some time now in multilateral development banks as well. As long as this is taken into consideration for the building new projects, especially that has the mitigation and adaptation schemes embedded in their design, I think it creates an opportunity again for us to really transform, to do the great reset, but really doing it in a sense of, okay, how do you go about it in engineering, in the financial schemes, in all the frameworks that you need? How do you walk the talk? I think this is the real challenge ahead of us in this decade. I couldn't agree more with all the other panelists in the examples that they provided.
Okay, Mr. Waba, we really have time for your very final remarks.
Absolutely a bankable concept. You know, basically as a mayor, if you're trying to attract investment, you're trying to create jobs, you're not just selling the enabling environment in your city or the infrastructure or the skills of the workforce, you're selling the city's resilience, you know, resilience to shocks and stresses, its emergency preparedness and response capacity, its ability to make sure that when it floods, you know, business operations are not interrupted, that when, you know, there's an earthquake, there's no casualties, the city doesn't come to a standstill. I mean, when you look at the amount of investor surveys where they opine on places that, you know, because of the shortages in electricity, the amount of lost production, because of this, because of that. So selling resilience as a metric by which you differentiate your city relative to competitors with investors has been, I've seen it in China. I mean, Chinese cities selling that to their to firms and investors seeking to locate. So definitely a bankable concept. Okay, how you measure it becomes a much longer thing. So maybe I'll stop here.
That's a topic for a new panel discussion. Well, thank you very much, Sameh Waba, Sergio Guzmao, Suchodowski, Monica Scatasta, and Nita Pocrel. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think that, you know, this infrastructure investment is such a topical issue moving forward, and even more so while, you know, governments across the globe are coming up and designing their recovery packages. And so definitely is something that the global, the public audience, and there is need for these workshops. And I think that, you know, today we have made a small step forward, but there is definitely need for more. And I leave it now to Franco Passacantando to add further steps to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all. I hope you found this workshop, this webinar, as interesting as I found it, and I really appreciated very much all your contributions. Would like to conclude with 3 remarks. First, is it right that the G20 addresses this issue? I mean, it's as I said, you know, first time we said that we should propose for the G20 a focus on local infrastructure. It sounded strange. Why is G20 having to deal with the local infrastructure? Actually, what I've heard today, it confirms that if the G20 is able to really raise the attention of the international community on this important aspect and not just on macro issues, and I think the contribution to really overcome to the crisis in which we're in will be great. So I have this confirmation, and I thank you all for this. We, by the way, our ambition is to develop some principles that could be applied, very general principles, and those are in the last part of our paper. So I really would like everybody to comment, to read them and to comment and make suggestions. Because then this is my second point. Definitely, we don't want to have a top-down approach on this issue. Definitely the issue of local infrastructure has to combine the top-down principles with the bottom-up suggestions. And I've heard many, many interesting suggestions today on how to improve partnership, communication between different local levels, local and national, national and supranational. So this mix of bottom-up and top-down approach is what is that we have to achieve. Final, the details. I've heard very, very many interesting suggestions on financing, on the need to go back to basic, of not relying too much only on external transfer, but set your house in order, develop your internal fiscal capacity, your own financial capacity, your own financial soundness as crucial. It is crucial for development. So this should be an agenda perhaps for a future workshop, even though as I say this, I'm worried that we will have to ask you to come back again, because I really think that you all gave a great contribution, and let me thank you again once more. Thank you and goodbye. We can conclude here. Ciao.